They believe there are conspiracy theories. There are situations where the state is withholding facts around Epstein and what happened there. And now you have those figures, such as, for example, Kash Patel, who at the head of the FBI, who said he didn't believe some of these things. He then enters the cabinet and he suddenly says, oh, there's nothing to see here.
How much is Trump turning on Putin? He's been swearing about him, Katy.
I think there's clearly been a shift in the mood when it comes to Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. If we think back to the infamous Oval Office summit between Donald Trump and Zelensky, leader of Ukraine, it was a scene that shocked lots of parts of the world because parts of the administration were so critical of the Ukraine leader. Now we have a situation where I think it's quite clear that Donald Trump is running out of patience with Russia. And that doesn't necessarily mean full-throated support for Ukraine, but certainly Zelensky is coming out slightly better from Putin in terms of how the White House is currently seeing things.
And so there may be more sanctions on Putin coming from the US administration. Is that what's like? I mean, whether this brings an end to the war, or Trump at some point might just walk away entirely, I guess.
I think that's the question, which is there have been points previously where Donald Trump has given these press conferences or a cabinet meeting and he has lashed out at Vladimir Putin, saying he's frustrated. Someone who he respected as a fellow strongman and so forth is not playing ball. It hasn't always led to sanctions or the type of punishments or responses that you might expect. And therefore, it is a bit of a waiting game. But I do think the concern of some Republicans and lots of Democrats is that we might end up in a situation where it just is almost this status quo when it comes to the Ukraine war, and a situation whereby the situation does not change in any particular way, and a slow war whereby Ukraine struggles for military. And yes, Donald Trump says that he would back Ukraine again and send more weapons. But where there's not really a push to an end isn't one that I think anyone would find particularly satisfactory on the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That speaking of sort of status quo, are you surprised less that more hasn't come out of the Netanyahu talks? It's been day two of them. Uh, that nothing seems to have been agreed when it comes to a ceasefire. Is that predictable? Do you think?
Well, I think the issue there is, of course, to agree a ceasefire, there is another party that has to be involved, Hamas, and ultimately the Palestinian side. And therefore, it was always going to be the case there's only so much Donald Trump can agree with the Israeli side. Now, the fact that they're back having talks on Tuesday night after having talks on Monday suggests that things are afoot. But I think with all these things, it is just a very careful calculation. And Donald Trump has surprised many times before, actually, sometimes on the upside in terms of what figures in foreign affairs have expected he is capable of doing. But the jury is out for now in terms of where they are getting to. I mean, we're hearing that there is one remaining issue to agree when it comes to that 60-day ceasefire deal, but there is no white smoke yet.
And indeed, even if there is a ceasefire, what follows after the ceasefire is as ever shrouded in doubt. Meanwhile, we've got President Macron over here, and he gave a speech to the UK Parliament saying he wants to end the dual dependencies of Europe, France and Britain, relying so much on China and the US. So there's an equivalence drawn between China and the US by President Macron. Trump's got a really interesting relationship with Macron, doesn't he? They seem to sort of slightly get on when they're in person, but then he slags him off as soon as he walks out the door. I presume. How will this play in America? I mean, does it matter there being equivalences being drawn between the US and China?
I suspect the idea that there is a equivalence between China and US in terms of Europe's approach is something that will not land well with lots of figures in Washington. I think to your point, there almost seems to be a begrudging respect between Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron at times. When Macron visited the Oval Office, he actually did have the courage or the nerve, depending how you look at it, to interrupt Donald Trump when he felt he was saying the wrong thing on Ukraine, to correct him how much funding Europe had given compared to the US, which I think other figures in Europe have seen have shied away from when they've been in those scenes. As for, I think, that comparison between the US and China, now, I think there are figures in the UK and other European countries that would say China is more of a hostile threat to Europe than America. But it definitely touches on this feeling, I think, across the continent that as America becomes more unpredictable, as the Trump administration starts to reassess the world order, long-standing allies and these relationships, it does mean that Europe no longer sees America as that reliable ally that they had previously.
And to a certain extent, Trump wants Europe to get its act together. I mean, he doesn't want to be compared to China necessarily, although I'm sure he sees some relationship between strong men like himself and President Xi. But he does want Europe to stand up for itself when it comes to things like Ukraine, doesn't he? That's one of his sort of policy aims.
Yes, and I think Donald Trump was clearly delighted, along with many of his colleagues, when you had the head of NATO refer to him as daddy recently, to the point that you saw the White House putting out merchandise and using it in all their branding. And the reason for that nickname was this idea that Donald Trump had forced European countries to up their defense spending. So I think he is quite happy to play the position of, I've said things you don't particularly want to hear, but it's led to good results. I think the question is on that dual dependencies point. It it does imply there is probably a more hostile undertone when it comes to dealing with America and China, both of them in different ways, as opposed to being, the father in the room who's encouraging Europe to do certain things on spending.
Just finally, Katy, you're in the US. The Epstein story. Trump was asked about it again yesterday. Can you just explain how significant or otherwise this is? I mean, because depending on who you follow on social media, depending on what outlets you listen to or read, it feels like a big issue that he promised to reveal all this information about Epstein, the Epstein files. There's questions about whether he's in them himself. And, a lot of the big Trump MAGA guys were saying, oh, he's all very transparent. It's a big deal for them that he's going to reveal this information, and he's not doing it. To explain how significant this story is or otherwise to it.
So on the domestic political spectrum, I think this is significant, and particularly when it comes to Donald Trump and the relationship with his base, so his core support, because Donald Trump is seen as someone who would go against the deep state. He's railed against the deep state many times, and lots of his supporters and some of his cabinet appointees have ultimately in the past said they believe there are conspiracy theories, there are situations where the state is withholding facts around Epstein and what happened there. And now you have those figures, such as, for example, Kash Patel, who, at the head of the FBI, he said he didn't believe some of these things. He then enters the cabinet and he suddenly says, oh, there's nothing to see here. And then you had Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, say that she had the so-called client list, and that's the alleged list of figures in Jeremy Epstein's orbit who he could have potentially blackmailed as a result of their involvement, on her desk in a Fox News interview, who then says, actually, there was no client list. So it definitely has the base quite spooked, and you've seen quite senior figures from Elon Musk, who of course has fallen out with Donald Trump, to Laura Loomer, blogger, conspiracy theorist, but one who has very close ties to Donald Trump, at least in the past, calling for Bondi's resignation. And generally speaking, a sense that they feel as though Donald Trump came in saying he would be Mr. Transparency, is not delivering on that. So I think it has some way to go still.
Interesting. It's a really interesting story. That. Katy, great to speak to you as ever. Thanks so much for joining us.